we have a little, if we conclude early, then we have a little treat, which is a little medrashic interpretation about the laws of the neighbors and the giving of the Torah. There's the famous medrash that is explained in light of the issue of the neighbors, and there's the Hasidic commentary on it. So maybe we'll dabble in that. I'm sorry if we came this morning expecting only law. We'll have a little bit of law, a little bit of mysticism, and hopefully you won't sign off. Hopefully you won't sign off early. Okay, but we'll see if we get that far. So what is the issue that we're going to address today? The issue that really we're going to address today is, okay, so we're talking about the laws of the neighbors. So somebody sells, an owner of the land sells the neighbor to me. I'm a stranger. Now the neighbor has the right to buy me out for the price that I paid, right? I'm the stranger, I paid a price. Okay, so here Maimonides quotes the Talmud and has a very interesting law, interesting scenario. So let's assume that this piece of land typically goes for $1,000. So we'll do Maimonides' case, $200. Let's say this piece of land goes for $200. The seller is my friend. My grandfather, whatever the case is, the seller is my friend. So the seller, as a personal favor to me, says, you know what? I'm going to sell you the land for $100 instead of for $200. So he gave me a $100 discount. Okay. Now the neighbor comes and the neighbor says he wants to evict me because he has the right, because I'm a stranger and he's the neighbor. And he has to reimburse me what I paid. But now I say, 1 second, you can't just give me $100 because $100 is not the value of the field. The value of the field is $200. The fact that I only bought it for $100 is because that guy did me a personal favor. He gave me a lower price. It's imagine that person just gave me a gift. So why would I have to pass over that savings to you? So my argument is, as the stranger, the fact that I bought it, the fact that the seller sold it to me for less does not mean that the land is worth less. It means that person does me a favor, and therefore the land is still worth $200. And therefore, if you want to get rid of me, you have to pay me $200. And the other guy says, either he says, the neighbor says, no, I'm going to pay you what you paid. And all kinds of issues come up here, and there's potential fraud, and we have to figure out who to believe and who not to believe. Was it sold for a discount? Was it not sold for a discount? This opens up a whole nother section. Thank God it's only in one halacha. It's only one law of Maimonides, so it's not going to take over too much real estate. I guess pun intended. We're talking about real estate, but so let's delve in and let's see what happens. So I'm going to let Maimonides speak for himself. I'm going to share the screen. Here we go. So this is chapter 14, which is the end. As you will see at the end, it concludes the laws of neighbors. We are right here, number 4. The following rules apply when a person sells property that is worth 200 zuz for a mana. Mana is 100 zuz. Why it has a different name? That's the way it was in Aramaic. Okay, so the seller sells me. I'm the foreign person. I'm the outsider. He sells me land. It's worth 200. He sells it to me for 100. Says Maimonides, what's going on? So the first thing let's figure out, did I get a discount for me, or was this the sale price for everybody? Right? You can go back at the Zillow report or at the Trulia. You can go back on the websites and see how much it was listed for. Right? How much, when you list estate, what did you list it for? If you listed for 100 for everybody, then you didn't sell it to me for 100. The value was 100. So that's how Maimonides begins. If the seller would discount the price for everyone, the neighbor is required to pay the purchaser only 100 zuz before he displaces him. If the seller would not discount the price for everyone, the neighbor must pay the purchaser the 200 zuz that the property is worth, for it is as if the seller gave the purchaser a gift. Now you can have many questions. How do we know? How do we not know? That's all for later. We want to begin with the principle. What's the concept? The concept is very simple, right? Forget about how to determine this. That becomes complicated. But the concept is straightforward. The concept is the seller sold me the land for $100. If his price for everybody was 100, in other words, he listed it for 100 for everybody, then The discount is for everybody. So the land is worth 100. And therefore, if I buy the land, I'm the foreigner, the neighbor could displace me, can get rid of me by reimbursing me only 100. Even though I say, well, I could sell it for 200, too bad. You bought it for 100, it's worth 100. Because the discount was not just given to you as an individual buyer, it was given to everybody. But if we know, how do we know? I don't know. We'll get to that later. But if we assume that this seller would have sold it to anybody for 200, and he only sold it to me for 100 because whatever reason he likes me, he's giving me a gift, then if the neighbor wants to displace me, he has to pay me 200 because the land is worth 200. The fact that the seller sold it to me for 100 is because he gave me a gift, right? Imagine I paid him 200 and he gave me back the land with $100 check. That's what we consider it. So that's the principle. Now the question, of course, the question is, how do you apply the principle? How do you know what happens if I claim one thing, the neighbor claims something else? That's not now everything starts unraveling. But this is the principle, and I think the principle is at least logical. At least you could see you can see the logic. I'm not saying it's the only way to look at it, but at least I think it makes sense. Again, when I say it makes sense in the Talmud, I don't mean that this is the absolute only way to think about it, but it means it's internally consistent. You could see the logic. Okay, now the fun begins. He said, she said, I don't know. He said he would sell it to everybody for 200. He wouldn't sell it to everybody for 200. You can imagine that this can create a lot of chaos. So let's continue. If a person, so the second paragraph of 4. If a person purchased property worth a maneh for 200 zuz. Oh, the other way. Oh, I forgot about this one. This is fascinating. A person purchased property worth a maneh for 200 zuz. A neighbor cannot displace him unless he gives him 200 zuz. This is funny. Okay, I want your land. I'm the neighbor. I'm sorry, I'm the foreigner. I want your land. So I come to you and I say, I'm going to buy your house for any price in the world. I overpay by $1 million. Right? So there's this, I have a friend in Greenwich who tells me, every house is for sale. Every house is for sale. You can get any house you want. Question is how much you're going to have to pay for it. Right? But you can go to anybody and pay them two, 3 times the amount of the house, they'll sell it to you. So I really want your house. You don't want to sell. So I come to you and say, I'm going to overpay $100. I'm going to overpay $1 million. So you sell me the house. I'm the foreigner. Now the neighbor shows up and the neighbor says, I have the right to displace you. So I say, okay, give me the $2 million. The neighbor says, 1 second. No, I'm only paying you $1 million because the value of all these houses on this block is only $1 million. I said, but I paid $2 million. He says, yeah, but you overpaid. I say, what? So what if I overpaid? That's what I paid. So here Maimonides says, of course, if the neighbor, even if I overpaid, even if the foreigner overpaid, if the neighbor wants to displace me, he has to pay me, reimburse me exactly what I paid. So in no case does the foreigner get a loss, right? The foreign person that's coming in will never lose money. So that's the next case, right? That was the next clause in Maimonides. So it's interesting how it's divided. Everything is logical. The first paragraph is where the neighbor bought it and the foreigner bought it for less than the value, right? The value is 200, but a guy sold it to me for 100. That was the first paragraph. The second paragraph is a case where the neighbor buys it, pays more than the value. I overpaid by 100. I overpaid by 100%. Still, even if I overpaid, if the neighbor wants to displace me, he has to pay me the full 200, right? I'll read it again. If a person purchased property worth a maneh for 200 zuz, right? So the land is worth 100. I pay 200. I'm a foreigner. I pay 200. I want into town. I want to get into town. I want to be able to live in Greenwich. So I'm willing to pay double. A neighbor cannot displace him unless he gives him 200. Now, what happens if the neighbor complains? The neighbor says there's potential fraud here. What's the scenario? Scenario is I move into the block. I buy a house. The neighbor says, I want to displace you. I'll pay you whatever you paid. I said, overpaid by $1 million. Everyone knows this block of houses is worth 1 million. I pay 2 million. The neighbor says, I don't believe you. What I think happened, I think you only paid 1 million and you claim to have paid 2 million because you want an extra million out of me. And you know what? Then you made a conspiracy with the seller. So the seller is also saying he got 2 million because you're going to split the extra million between you and the seller. Now, today we're sitting here, we know it's very easy to track money because we have banking and we have electronic, everything is recorded. But in the ancient world, there's no receipt, not necessarily is every transaction recorded in an organized way. So I say I paid 2 million. The neighbor says you didn't pay 2 million. It's a conspiracy. You and the seller claim that you paid 2 million, so that you get an extra million out of me, and you'll split the extra million. Right? So what do we do in that case? In that case, the law is that the neighbor just claims it's not enough. It's not enough to stop. It's not enough. The claim is not enough. In other words, if the neighbor wants to take my land, he has to pay me 2 million. He has to pay me the full amount that I claim, because his claim that maybe there's a conspiracy is not enough. If you want to come in and disperse and displace me, the foreign buyer, you're going to have to pay the full amount that the buyer claims to have paid. However, there is a caveat. We do give the neighbor a little bit of something. The neighbor would have to take, the foreigner would have to take an oath that he paid 2 million. So let's read the third paragraph. If the neighbor protests, and he says they are perpetrating an act of deception together, meaning to say that the neighbor says that this house was not sold for 2 million, it was sold for 1 million. But the buyer and the seller claim that it was sold for 2 million because they want to get an extra million out of the neighbor. Nevertheless, the purchaser must take an oath while holding a sacred article. Afterwards, he may collect the 200 zuz. So you make the purchaser swear, but you make him swear. But once he swears, he gets the full 200. And now you have another case which will make him swear, but we don't make him swear. If you notice, if you want the subtlety here, there's an oath with it while holding a sacred article. That would mean, we stopped doing it now about 1,000 years ago, but in the times of the Mishnah, times of the Talmud, an oath, the way it's described in the Torah, is that you would actually have to hold something holy, like a Torah scroll, and you have to swear while holding the Torah scroll. That was considered a very severe oath. People were not jumping to take that oath. Later, we'll see in the next case, we also impose an oath, but it's an oath that's a much lesser degree. It doesn't mention God's name, and you don't have to hold a sacred article. And that case is a little bit different. That case is that similar case. I bought the land I'm a foreigner. I came into town. I buy land. The neighbor says he wants to displace me. The neighbor says, how much did you pay? I say, I paid 2 million. The neighbor says, what do you mean? The value of the land is 1 million. I say, I paid 2 million. So that's the case. And the neighbor says, no, it's a conspiracy. That's in that sense, it's exactly as the previous case. This case is different because I also have witnesses that I paid 2 million. But the neighbor nevertheless says, yes, you paid 2 million. But then after everybody went home, the seller gave you back 1 million. Okay? So it's a similar case. It's a similar case in the sense that the neighbor claims conspiracy, but the difference, the different thing, that the fraud or deception, in other words, the neighbor says it was not really a sale for 2 million, it's really a sale for 1 million. So in this case, so in the previous case, if there's no witnesses that I paid 2 million, I would have to swear, holding a sacred article, holding a Torah, and then I collect 2 million from the neighbor if the neighbor wants the land. This case is different. This case, I have witnesses that I paid 2 million. But the neighbor says, yeah, you paid 2 million, but the guy's going to give you back the million tomorrow. In that case, if the neighbor wants to displace me, he has to pay me the 2 million. I have to take an oath, but not as severe oath as before. Now we'll see that inside. Finally, the last case, if there were witnesses that the purchaser gave 200 zuz, but the neighbor claims that there was an agreement between him and the seller, and that he definitely knows that in truth the seller took only 100 zuz from him, the neighbor must pay the amount of money the witnesses stated, which is 2 million, Afterwards, he may displace the purchaser and require him to take a shvuat heses that he purchased the property for 200 zuz. After taking that oath, he is under no further obligations. In other words, it's a much lesser form of an oath. Okay, fine. That's the case here. If there's any questions or comments, I'm happy to take it before we get to the next subject, which is a little bit lighter. But again, all the laws that fall into the category of potential fraud because of the fact that I claim that I bought the land for more than the value, and remember, that would be a good way. Think of it. It's not just a far-off case. Think of it. If I want to buy the land and I want to go circumvent the right of first refusal, it's very logical for me to pay more, right? We discussed this issue in the past, and that is like this. I'm not an economist, but it seems to me that this law almost lowers the price of homes. It pushes the price of homes down because it limits the pool of buyers. So in that sense, it's harmful for the housing prices of the seller because the seller will not be able to get as much as he wants because the pool of buyers shrinks potentially. We discussed that. But I also mentioned that I think, again, I'm not an economist, but I think that there's also another force. The other force is that the right of first refusal actually puts a pressure on lifts to raise the prices. Why? Because if I'm an outsider and I want to protect against, and I want to buy a house, and I don't want the neighbor to buy me out, what I would do is I would offer more money than the value. And in that case, that's an opposing pressure to raise the price. So in other words, the number one protection against the right of first refusal is to pay a lot. So now it's very common. It's very likely that there would be some fraud because if I want to circumvent the right of first refusal, I would just claim that I pay too much. So I think that this law is actually probably more common than we imagine, because there would be a scenario. Most likely, I would pay more than the value if I'm a foreigner, and most likely that the neighbor would suspect that I'm not really paying more. Why would I want to pay more? So I just think that this is an important discussion. And again, there's so many, we can't get into every detail here, but there's so many other scenarios and discussions within this category. But again, it's all about the discussion of if I paid too much, if I overpaid or underpaid, how does that fit into the obligation of the neighbor to reimburse me what I paid if I didn't pay market value? If I paid more, we said he has to be reimbursed. If there's a claim of fraud, I just take an oath and I still get the full amount that I paid. If I paid lower than the amount, then it depends if he lowered the price for everybody or for me. If we're not sure, so I hope I'm not getting too detailed. If we're not sure if he lowered the price for everyone or for me, we basically say it's a dispute, but most people believe, Maimonides believes, the buyer wins. In other words, going back to the first scenario, the scenario is that the land is worth $200. I'm a foreigner. I come in, I buy it for 100, and the neighbor says, how much did you pay? I say 100. So the neighbor wants to give me 100. I say, no, the value of the land is 200. So we said the law is that if the owner lowered the price only for me, only for the foreign buyer, then the neighbor has to reimburse me the full 200. What happens if we don't know? So here there's a dispute. It's post-Talmudic sages argue. Consensus is, and many people believe that Maimonides believes this way also, he doesn't say it explicitly, but we assume that that's what Maimonides says, is that if you don't know, then who's in possession? The foreign buyer is in the possession. So if you have a dispute and you're trying to get something out of the person in possession, the burden of proof is upon the neighbor. And because we don't know, the neighbor would have to give the foreign buyer the full amount, not the 100, but the 200. Okay, that's all for the numbers. That's all for the dispute. Now we get to a little bit different set area, which is, is there a hierarchy of who you should sell to if nobody here is your neighbor? In other words, till now we said it's better to sell to your neighbor. What happens if you list your property? None of your neighbors want the land. you have two bids, one from a guy in your town and one from your second cousin living in Australia. Same amount of money, same cash, same currency. All else being equal, is there a value in selling to one over the other? And we're going to have a whole list of hierarchy of who you should sell to. So let's see what happens, and we'll see if it gets you nervous. But let's see what happens. Let's see what happens. So I'm just going to read it through. It's not very complicated. We'll read it, and then we'll see if I can add anything, and then we'll conclude. Okay. The following rules apply. It's a bad translation. It's not rule. It's not rules. It's anyone who wants to sell land. Okay. Whenever a person wants to sell landed property, and two people come offering to purchase it, and each one is willing to pay the same price, and neither of them is a neighbor. Okay, so I have two bids, same amount of money, same currency. They're both either paying in cash or both getting a mortgage. It doesn't matter. Everything is the same. So which one should I sell to? Says Maimonides, if one of the prospective purchasers was an inhabitant of the city, and the other dwelled in the outlying fields, the inhabitant of the city is given priority. Okay, I don't know why they're translating it this way exactly. Let me see, make sure I'm saying it right. Okay, both people, they're not translating 100% right. I'm going to translate it the way the commentaries do, not the other dwellers in the outlying fields. But in the Hebrew says, one of them is your neighbor in the city, and one of them is your neighbor in the field. In other words, none of them are adjacent, right? It's not considered neighboring. None of them is adjacent to your land. So the law of the neighbor does not apply. But now the question is, who should you sell to? Sell to someone closer to you. But who's closer to me? So I have one person who lives 2 blocks away from me in town. So he's my neighbor in the city. I mean, not technically, he's not neighboring. He's not halachically, he's not neighboring in the sense that he's not adjacent to my land, but he lives 2 blocks away from me in the city. And the other guy is my neighbor because his field is 3 fields down from me in the field. So I have 2 neighbors. I have a neighbor, or I think of it in contemporary situations. One person is the neighbor of where you live. One person you see when you walk your dog or you jog in where you live. And the other guy is your neighbor in your office, right? He works 2 blocks away from you, and you see him every day when you go eat lunch. Okay, so we have 2 neighbors. We know we want to sell to someone close to you, but who's closer? So one person is close to you in the city, the other person is close to you in the fields. Says Maimonides, the inhabitant of the city is given priority. The neighbor where you live is given priority. If one of them lives close to the property being sold, and the other is a Torah scholar. Okay, so here again, it's not adjacent. If it's adjacent, the guy adjacent wins. He's not adjacent. He's a guy who lives in town, lives 2 blocks away, but the other guy is a Torah scholar. The Torah scholar is given priority. Now, you shouldn't think, unless you think a very interesting law is that the commentaries point out and say, you know something, this law that you should give priority when you sell your land to a Torah scholar, this law never made it into the code of law. It's in Maimonides, it's in the Talmud, it's not in the code of law. Why isn't it in the code of law? So it's very funny, but this commentaries explain, the Ramah, a commentary on the code of law explains that because today there are no Torah scholars. In other words, we're not talking about the Torah scholars of today. They're not in the class of Torah scholars that the Talmud is talking about. In other words, in the Talmudic days, the Torah scholars were real Torah scholars, so they would get priority. But today, the Torah scholars of today are not. Unfortunately, I guess they're not Torah scholars enough. They're not on that level, and therefore they do not get priority. And therefore, this law in Maimonides in the Talmud does not trickle its way down into the code of law. I thought that was interesting. Next. If one of the perspective, similarly, if one is a relative and the other is a Torah scholar, the Torah scholar is given priority. If one is a relative and the other lives close to the property, the one who lives close to the property is given priority. For this is an act of good and just. This is very interesting. If I have a cousin living in Australia and I have a neighbor living around the corner, says Maimonides, says the Talmud, it's better to sell to the neighbor. In other words, not adjacent neighbor. Again, if it's adjacent, then the previous laws apply. But if it's not, even if it's not an adjacent neighbor, a guy lives a block away from you, or your cousin living in another town, have good relations with your neighbor, sell to your neighbor. They quote a verse from King Solomon who says, better to have a close neighbor than a distant relative. In other words, the relative that lives far away. In other words, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to create a harmony between the neighbors, because ultimately that's what affects your quality of life. Okay, next. Because it's considered an act of good and justice. In any of the above situations, now we're going to basically say that everything we said is just the right thing to do, but if you didn't do that, it doesn't matter, the sale is valid. Unlike the law of the bar metzra, the actual neighbor who's adjacent, who can evict the buyer, the foreign buyer, in all the cases that we said in section 5, that I'm supposed to sell to someone in this town over a relative in a different town, or I should sell to a Torah scholar in biblical times. This is all recommendation, but it's not the law. And therefore, if I sold to the foreigner or if I sold to anybody else, it cannot be overturned. So in other words, section 5, unlike everything we said till now, is just a recommendation, but it cannot be enforced. And that's what we say in the last paragraph. In any of the above situations, if the other person acted first and acquired the property, his colleague does not have the right to displace him, for neither of them owns property bordering on the property being sold. And our sages established these rules only as an expression of piety and a generous spirit. But in other words, it's a nice recommendation, but it's not the law. And therefore, all these cases are nice recommendations if you get both bids and they're exactly the same who you should sell to. But ultimately, if you sell to whoever wants you sell to anybody else, it cannot be overturned. Unlike the law of the adjacent, unlike if the neighbor is adjacent to your property, in that case, barring all the exceptions we said in the last 3 chapters, if none of the exceptions apply, then the neighbor can actually displace the foreign purchaser. And finally, Mazel Tov, we finished the laws. This concludes the laws of neighbors. Mazel Tov, l'chaim. Cheers.
Rabbi, can I ask you a quick question?
Please, yes.
About the person having living in the city having the advantage, because I think there was a law before where the convenience of the working the field takes the precedent. So when did we go from there to here?
That was if it was adjacent. If your field is adjacent to the other field, if you're adjacent to the other field, the neighbor of the field comes first. What we're saying here, you're not adjacent to any of them, right? They're not technically neighbors. They're not halachically neighbors because they're not touching you. Halachically neighbors, and we said bar metzra in Aramaic, the term is exact. Bar metzra doesn't mean neighbor. Bar metzra means the one who owns your, metzer is the border. The guy who's sitting on your border, literally sitting on the border of your field, right? So if he's sitting literally on the border of your field, he gets precedence. And that's when the field, if I have a neighbor who's neighboring my field and I'm selling a field and the other field is adjacent to my field, I have to sell to the field next to me, not to my neighbor sitting next to my house, because I'm not selling the house, I'm selling the field. But this case is a different case. We're not talking, nobody's adjacent to my field. I'm selling a field and I want good relations with my neighbors. Who's my neighbors? But again, I'm selling it, the potential, the guy who wants the field, I have one foreigner coming from the West Coast, and then I have another guy, forget it, not the foreigner, I have two people who are not adjacent to my field. One guy lives down the block from me, so I see him every day when I go jogging. And the other guy is 1 acre away, a few acres away from me in the field. So I see him every day when I go to plant my field, right? So I need good relations with neighbors. Which neighbor? Oh, so here it's telling you in a sense, he's not saying these words, but in a way he's telling you that better to have good relations in your place of residence than good relations in the place where you work, because where you work is secondary to where you live.
Beautiful, thank you. And another question I had, how do you define the Torah scholar?
So that's what I said. Today, the Ramah says, the Ramah, which was the greatest, basically the code of law for Ashkenazim. He lived in the 16th century. He says there are no Torah scholars today. In other words,
but back then, how did you define it?
Back then, I would assume if a person is a Talmudic scholar, there are cases in the Talmud where one of the Talmudic scholars came to town and they said, maybe just buy from him first. They would honor the Torah scholars. Was it every Torah scholar? What is it? A select few? I don't know. But it's funny. It's interesting how you have a law in the Talmud and you have a law in Maimonides, and then the subsequent generations say, hey, how come this law never made it into the code of law? It's a very interesting question. It's not here. The answer is, well, I'm sorry. You think you're a Torah scholar, but you still have
Yeah.
to go. So
The
there's
question is about definition. How do you define
yeah,
it? That
yes,
cannot-
yeah. Short answer is I don't know, but I know that we don't have any. That's
Yeah.
that's the short answer.
We
So,
even we do. We know we do, but we don't know how to define the actual.
if I
When
thought I'm a
they
Torah scholar,
yeah.
I'm saying if I thought I'm a Torah scholar, this is a wake-up call. Okay, I can't get precedent in where I want to buy real estate. No. So I'll have to overpay if I want to get into town. Okay. Okay, so that's the story in short. That's the law. A little bit of Medrash, a little bit of Kabbalah, Medrash and a little bit of Kabbalah. We have a few minutes left. We'll try to do this quickly. So this is a talk that the Rebbe spoke on Shavuot, the holiday that we got the Torah. What's happening here? So let me give you just a little bit of background here. Let's open this up. So the Talmud says, Talmud Tractate Shabbat, page 88. There's a discussion here about the giving of the Torah. And the Talmud says like this. Remember, it's medrash, so it's a metaphor, but the concepts exist. The concept is that the claims are all true. So let's see what's happening. When Moses went up to the heaven to receive the Torah, the angels spoke before God, and they said, Master of the universe, what is a Yelud Isha? What is a person born to a woman? In other words, what is a human being doing in heaven? So God says, what do you mean? He came to receive the Torah. So they said, what? This precious treasure that is hidden within the heavens, and you want to give it to a person of flesh and blood? How could you give the Torah to a human being? They said, they quote the verse, Ma'enesh, what is man that you remember him? Place your glory on the heavens. In other words, the angels say, why are you giving the Torah to human beings? Human beings are not worthy. You want to give the Torah to somebody? Give it to the angels. That's the claim that the angels make to Moses. Again, does it mean literally, or does it mean the idea? The idea is when the Torah is given, there's a claim of why give the Torah to a human being. It's God's wisdom should be given to the angels. Whoops. Something is jumping out here. Give me just a second. I think the angels are not happy with me, so it's jumping. Okay, so what happens? So the Talmud continues. So God tells Moses, respond. Right? It's like they go to court. You go to court, and one lawyer makes a claim. The judge does not. It's not the judge's problem. Let the opposing counsel answer. So God tells Moses, respond, give them an answer. So Moses says, God, Master of the universe, the Torah that you're giving, what does it say in the Torah? So he says, it says the first commandment, on the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. So Moses says, did you go down to Egypt? Were you enslaved in Egypt? Next, why would the Torah go for you? Number 2, what does it say in the Torah? Don't serve idols. So Moshe says to the angels, do you dwell amongst the nations of the world that serve idols, that you have to be told not to serve idols? Next, what does it say? Rest on Shabbat. Do you do work? Next, do you do business? Do you have parents that you have to honor? Is there any jealousy between you that the Torah says don't that the 10 Commandments have to say don't covet? Do you have the evil inclination? So the angels acknowledged, and they said that you're right. You're right, Moses. Moses, you're right. So that's a beautiful medrash, and it's nice sermon material for the holiday of Shavuot. What does this connect to us? Connects to us that there are many commentators who explain that what was the original claim of the angels who say that the Torah should be given to the angels. Why the angels? What is their claim? Like, what's their claim? Because they're more spiritual? What's the claim? So some people say the claim was this law of Bar Mitzvah, the law of the neighbors. They're spiritual, they're angels, they're God's neighbors. God is selling his Torah to the human being. I'm sorry, we're the neighbors, we're willing to buy it. That is how many places explain the foundation of the claim of the angels. We're the neighbors of the Torah, we want the Torah. And that's a beautiful interpretation. The problem with this interpretation is, and then there's a whole list of explanations of why their claim is wrong, why the law of a neighbor does not apply here. So for example, we learned that the law of the neighbor only applies to real property, not movable property, right? If you want to sell your Porsche, you don't have to sell it to your neighbor, you can sell it to anybody else. So they say the Torah is not real property. Or we say, well, we said that we also said, for example, that the law only applies to a sale, not to a gift. Well, the Torah is a gift. Number two, we're also God's relatives. So we are also close, so we should get it, right? We said with relatives, the law doesn't apply, et cetera, et cetera. There are other explanations that explain why the law of the neighbor does not apply to the Torah and does not apply to the angels. All wonderful. So that's just sort of a digest of what happened for how this subject was addressed until the Rebbe's commentary. Then the Rebbe comes and says, 1 second, all fine and well. This the Rebbe spoke in 1958. All fine and well that you say that the claim of the angels was that they're neighbors, and you found many interpretations to explain why the law of the neighbor does not apply. But if that's the case, how come none of those interpretations are alluded to in Moses' answer? Right? What's Moses' answer? Moses' answer is not, well, the Torah is a sale. Well, a Torah is real property, as movable property, not real property. That's not what Moses says. Moses says you don't have an evil inclination. You're not amongst the nations. You don't have jealousy, and therefore the Torah doesn't apply to you. So what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to do both together. We're going to try to say the angels, their claim was because of the neighbors, the law of the neighbor. Moses' response is really responding and explaining why the law of the neighbor does not apply to you. But we have to find that within Moses' words. At the surface, we don't see that within Moses' words. So there's a whole talk here, a few pages. We don't have that much time, but in short, the kernel of what the Rebbe says is as follows. One of the exceptions we explained that the law of the neighbor does not apply if the foreigner wants to build a home, right? We said if the neighbor wants to buy the land because he wants to plant, and the foreigner wants to buy the land because he wants to build a home, we said building a home takes precedent, and we are trying to figure out how come. Maybe if your home is more necessary than planting, because planting you can buy. If you need vegetables, go to the marketplace and buy vegetables. But a home you actually need. The need for the home is more pressing. So whatever the discussion was, we discussed that a few weeks ago. Whatever the discussion is, the law was that the law of the neighbor does not apply if the foreign purchaser wants to build a home. Says the Rebbe, if you look at the Hasidic interpretation, quotes the Medrash. And they ask the question, what's the purpose of the creation of the world? Most general question you could ask. Why did God create the world? Right? Why does God has everything he needs? Why is he creating the world? So there's different answers. One answer said in the Medrash, and this is the answer that the Hasidic philosophy says is the essential answer. All the other answers are details of that, but that's not the essential answer. The essential answer is because God wants, and this is a quote, God wants a home in the lower domain. What is a home? A home is a place where you can be with all your essence. When I come to your house, I have to behave. I have to make sure I'm behaving. I make sure I'm my best behavior. In my house, I could take off my shirt. I can get comfortable. I can wear socks that have holes in them. I don't have to make an impression, right? The home is where you are where you express yourself fully. So when you say you want to make a home for God in the lower realm, you mean that we want the purpose of creation. God is in heaven. Of course, he's available in heaven. God says, you know what? Let's create an area, a space, a state of mind where God is not present. In other words, he's not revealed. In other words, within the consciousness of the creation, there is no God is irrelevant. And then the Jewish people come about and bring God's presence into this world, create a home for God in this lower world. Home means you're bringing his essence here. Even when you go to work, you're not bringing your essence. When you go at home is where you are sort of for yourself, but not interacting with the world. Says the Rebbe, what is one of the exceptions? And that's essentially what, okay, so let's tie all the knots together. One of the exceptions we said that, I said this, we said that because the Moshe, the Jewish people, we're foreigners, we're not spiritual, we're not close to God, we're distant from God, we have evil inclination, we're far. The angels are right that they're closer, they're neighbors. But we are the ones who make a home for God, not the angels. And because we make a home for God, that is the exception to the rules of the neighbor. That's why we get the Torah. And if you go through the Medrash and you see all the things that Moshe answers, we have evil inclination. We're in Egypt. we're subject to the enslavement. We're challenged by the other nations of the world. In other words, we are in the lowest domain. We're the place where God wants a home. So we're the ones who build a home. And if we're the ones who build a home, then the law of the neighbor does not apply, because it's nice to be a neighbor, but the concept of a home takes precedence. So that is, in short, the Rebbe's interpretation of this concept of the neighbor, in connection to the Medrash that says that the angels are the neighbor, but the fact that we get the Torah is because we circumvent the law of the neighbor, because we have an overarching, a more pressing need, and that is the pressing need to make a home for God in the realm where there's jealousy, where there's temptation, where there's challenges, and that is where we make the home for God. And that's why God says, the neighbor is nice, but if you're going to make me a home, you get the Torah. So this is the story in short, ladies and gentlemen. I guess next week we'll start something new. Take a 4-week break, as we said, talk about the anti-Semitism, and then we get back to Maimonides and Talmud. Very much looking forward to that. Thank you for joining, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Beautiful.